If you believe climate change will be an increasingly severe in the near term problem for us. Now, keep them raised if you believe that humans may have missed our boat, missed our window on the opportunity to thoroughly correct what's going on. How about that? Many of you. Okay, so I'm amongst people who are not in the unknown. So we are all in the unknown.
You don't have that word for
Yeah. All right. So Dr. Guy McPherson is no stranger to these kind of questions. In fact, this is the very territory in which he resides, and asks these questions and deeper ones, like, how do you want to live out the rest of your days? Dr. Guy McPherson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona in Conservation Biology. He has been called a doomsday quote leader. However, what he is a concerned citizen, a concerned scientist who is profoundly curious about climate change, as am I. He has learned and continues to learn and keeps up with the science. And he travels the world for over a decade now, sharing what he knows with people because he cares. And he wants us to know and to care as well. He feels that we are in a serious crisis and that it's going to increase in short order. He will introduce us to a term called abrupt climate change that some of us may have heard of. And the discussion today will prompt you to listen deeply with the inner ear of your heart. I encourage you to do so. And to discern what is true for you and to live accordingly. I discovered Dr. Guy McPherson only a few months ago. As a busy grad student here in the communication program, I waste as much time as I can on YouTube, and I discovered Dr. Guy McPherson there. I immediately reached out and invited him to come join us in Fairbanks and to Nino, my home community, to share with us his knowledge and wisdom and his concern, so as to inspire deeper, realer, and more authentic conversations in our communities about what we believe is coming next. I've invited him to share his precious time with us, and he graciously agreed to do so. He's brought his partner, Pauline Schneider, who's in the back, and they're visiting us in town for just a few days. We get to enjoy Chino on Saturday. As a follow-up to tonight's conversation, which will focus more on the evidence, tomorrow night at Scheibel at 7 o'clock, we will talk more about our response. Tonight we'll get into that as well, but it's more science-y this evening. We do encourage you to come again tomorrow and to share that this lecture is happening. We have 3 different sizes of posters that you can take with you on either corner near the door. Little quarter sheets, this size, and then a grande size. Take them with you on your way out, and hand them to friends, take them at your dock tomorrow to encourage a full turnout tomorrow night. Saturday night, we are having a small and private gathering of interested individuals who want to continue this conversation over the long term that we hope we have. And if you want to be on that list, first we encourage you to sign in on our sign-in sheets that are on either side. And if you'd like to be invited via email to that Saturday night event, location TBA, depending on how many people sign up, please put a star next to your name and we'll know how to reach you. So my name is Cachet Garrett, and I'm a graduate student at UAF from Juneau, as I said. I moved up here to study communication, and I aspire to be a future leader of Alaska, if time permits, and if you will have me. And what I intend to do is just encourage people to be very real and authentic with each other, and to have deep conversations, and to honor each other and to love each other. And this is the message that Dr. McPherson brings. In the end, only love remains. I ask you now to silence your cell phones, and to please remember to sign up on the sheet. I will pass them around during Q&A. Dr. McPherson delivers his presentations at no expense. I did fly him up on my miles, and I am happy to do so. We're taking a love offering during the Q&A. I'll pass around the honey bucket. So put dollars in there if you appreciate the time that he's given to us now. I do want you to know that this conversation is about near-term extinction. And if you are prone to depression, if you do not want to have this conversation, there's no shame in leaving now. Otherwise, I am happy that you're here. I'm very pleased that you're here. I'm excited for the Q&A after. And I want to take a moment to give a special thank you to Danny Vaziri, who designed our beautiful poster. Have you seen it in color? Ice cream cone of the earth melting. And I want to thank the Student Senate of this university, which I'm a senator of, they've been very supportive of this endeavor. And also the RISE board, the Office of Sustainability, and the RISE Advisory Board, which I sit on as well, has graciously agreed to host Dr. McPherson's speeches. We have books for sale at the end. Dr. McPherson will stay around and sign them. And we have hard copies. These are $30, and the soft copy, $15. And I encourage you to take this book. He has several books. This is his most recent. I think that's everything I wanted to say. I just want to conclude again with deep, sincere gratitude that you are here, and I encourage you to come again tomorrow night. Please be inspired. Stay and conversate with us after. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. I know your time is precious. I know your time is short. Thanks to my partner Pauline, who's behind the camera in the back. And thanks to Cachet for the wonderful introduction, for hosting us in her home, and for being the primary shaker and mover between all of us being gathered here today. What I'm going to talk about is not a lot of fun. It hasn't been a lot of fun for me since 2002, when I reached the conclusion I'm going to talk about today. It has been devastating in terms of my personal relationships, and I hope that you can avoid the same happening to you. So I'm no fan of what I'm going to talk about, which is really interesting. I'm going to proceed in three parts. I'll talk about definitions a little bit. I'll talk about the evidence underlying the loss of habitat for our species, leading to the loss of our species. And then I'll talk very briefly about how we might process this information as individuals and as communities. And I'll focus more on the latter topic tomorrow. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A after today's and tomorrow's presentations as well.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that the domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. What I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds, and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Ooh. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
So think about that for a minute. 29 dominoes, 28 dominoes from something this big to the Empire State Building. That's an example of the exponential function. It's incredibly difficult for us to wrap our minds around because for the most part, we live linearly. We live gradualized. For the most part, we can fairly reliably predict the near future based on the recent past. But once we begin a process involving the exponential function, that is no longer the case. Habitat, according to my Merriam-Webster online dictionary, is the place or environment where a plant or animal normally lives and grows. And that'll do for now. I've taught entire semester-long courses at the graduate level on habitat. So recognize that it's a very simplistic definition. We can take an organism from the wild, where it normally lives and grows, and keep it alive in a jail cell, in a zoo, for an extended period of time, but that's not habitat. Humans, too, have a habitat where they normally live and grow, and we can take them out of that habitat and put them into an urban zoo, but that is not the place that a human, at least historically, normally lives and grows. This is an artificial environment that depends upon a whole bunch of things outside that urban zoo for the people to survive in the city. Think about the water and the food and the clean air and where they come from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the rate of change because it's so critically important. Thus, the short video showing the exponential function. Rate of change is tremendously important, as people who study extinction and speciation and habitat are aware. That means conservation biologists. According to a now relatively old paper, June 2013, this from the peer-reviewed literature, projecting IPCC style into a linear, slow increase in global average temperature, assuming that's the way things go, then we're outstripping habitat for vertebrates, outstripping the ability of vertebrates to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. So a very slow rate of change over the course of between now and 2100 outstrips the ability of vertebrates to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. We're vertebrates. A little closer to home, or maybe to Homo sapiens, mammals too are failing to keep up. A more recent paper, this one from October of last year, indicates that even if extinction rates slow to background levels, and there's no indication that they will, considering we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, then it will take millions of years to catch up. We're mammals too. So vertebrates and mammals are losing habitat as a result of a rapid rate of change, and the rate of change is only beginning to accelerate. This rate of change threatens industrial civilization. Jim Bendell and Rupert Reed are both English climate scientists, and they point out quite recently that the rate of change is coming close already to outstripping the ability of this set of living arrangements to stay together. Industrial civilization, this set of living arrangements, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, these are what Bendell and Rupert Reed are talking about. And then more recently, the famed David Attenborough, quoted in The Guardian, indicates that the collapse of civilization is on its way. This is nothing new. Before Van Jones became Barack Obama's green job czar back in 2007, he said he's been to Davos and he sat with all these famous people, Bill Clinton and Bill Gates and Tony Blair and Nancy Pelosi, and these are the people that we tend to think are in charge. That's why we elect our political leaders, is so that they will lead. And we tend to think that they're in charge of this set of living arrangements. As he points out, they're terrified. They're terrified. They don't know what to do. So they keep juggling chickens and chainsaws and hope it all works out, just like most of us every day at work. They haven't been in charge for a long time. Van Jones was referring specifically to global peak oil or net energy decline and the resulting decrease in available fossil energy, a phenomenon that has been put off by at least a decade as a result of United States shale. But it's still coming. talk about 2 degrees C being a target as pure human hubris. We're at the upper limit right now. In fact, we're probably beyond that upper limit of 1.73 right now because it's been a year since the conclusion was reached by Sam Carana. Sam Carana is an interesting person. He uses a pseudonym so that he doesn't have the same kinds of things happen to him as happened to me, which is defamation, libel, character assassination, slander, and threats on his life. So he or she, I'm pretty sure I know who this is, a climate scientist working in Europe, where the tenure system doesn't offer nearly as much protection as it does in the United States. So this person remains in hiding and does excellent work from there. 2 degrees C has never been a viable target, as pointed out by the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in October of 1990. They pointed to 1 degree C as the absolute upper limit beyond which we could elicit the exponential function. They say it in slightly different language than that, but that's what nonlinear, unpredictable, and rapid changes mean. And importantly here, they acknowledge the importance of ecosystems. This could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. The United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in October of 1990 knew that we were human animals, and therefore we depend upon habitat for our own survival. And where is that habitat? It's in the ecosystems. It's not in the city, it's not in the urban zoo. It's in the ecosystems that provide all of our clean air and clean water and food and insects that we're rapidly losing through the insect apocalypse that pollinate our food and clean our water and so on. I'm going to go briefly through 7 examples of what could lead to functional extinction. And I'm going to focus here on functional extinction or loss of habitat for Homo sapiens. Because once we have functional extinction, there is no longer a place for us to live on Earth, except in facilities with very controlled environments. So once we reach the point of functional extinction, we become like the passenger pigeons that ran out of habitat, but we managed to keep a few of them alive in a zoo. I'm not interested in living in a zoo. I'm not interested in living in a bunker. So I'm not going to try to indicate when the last human being will die. I'm going to indicate when habitat will be lost for our species. It can be lost any number of ways, and what's important here is the rate of change. Again, the rate of change is all important in discussing environmental change and how we might adapt. Natalia Shkova and colleagues more than 10 years ago at the European Geophysical Union meetings indicated that we could expect a 50 gigaton burst of methane from the relatively shallow seabed of the Arctic Ocean, and that is highly possible for abrupt release at any time. And they indicated this would cause a 1.3 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise in a very short period of time. That rate of change to that very high temperature level will be catastrophic for almost all life on Earth. Methane is more than 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, molecule for molecule. Methane is a really, really big deal that we don't hear nearly enough about. Shkova and colleagues drew a lot of fire early on for their work, most notably from Gavin Schmidt, who replaced James Hansen as the United States leading climate scientist, and also from David Archer. Both of these individuals are modelers who don't spend much time in the field. Shkova and colleagues have conducted some 50 expeditions above and beneath the Arctic ice. A 10-member research team involving nobody from Shkova's research team concluded in June of 2017 that the distinct episodes of methane release have occurred in the past and therefore are likely to occur in the future. Shkova and colleagues had a paper published that same year, that same month, and indicate that CH4 or methane is likely to be released in a manner that they discussed some 9 years earlier. And then Wild et al. Just a few months ago concluded pretty much the same thing, that contrary to what the modelers have been saying, the field research indicates that an abrupt release of methane is in fact highly likely at any time. Notice Shakova and colleagues did not say that an ice-free Arctic would be required for such a release of methane. They indicated that it was highly possible for abrupt release at any time. This more than 10 years ago. The second potential source of planetary methane going into the atmosphere and abruptly warming the planet is from the permafrost. And you don't have to look far to find lots of evidence of permafrost melting away. I was fortunate to go to the Creamer's research site a day or two ago. It gets a little fuzzy when I've been traveling. I have no idea where I'm at or what day it is. Oh, I don't need to be traveling for that. And I saw the results of methane being released from the permafrost in the field. And this recent paper in the peer-reviewed journal Geosciences indicates that terrestrial permafrost has been releasing methane measured up to 8,500 parts per million. Bear in mind that methane is typically measured in parts per billion. Parts per billion. So this measurement in parts per million is equivalent to 8.5 million parts per billion methane in the atmosphere. This is enormous. And again, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas relative to carbon dioxide. Of course, continued industrial activity continues to heat the planet. Tim Garrett, professor at the University of Utah, has done considerable work on this topic. He's now the head of the atmospheric sciences program at the University of Utah. His first paper on the topic was initially published in 2009. And if you read all the way down to the bottom there, it indicates that Garrett treats civilization like a heat engine. In fact, this is his primary finding, subsequently supported by a couple of other papers, that civilization, no matter how we operate it, is a heat engine. We can switch to solar panels, wind turbines, wave power, whatever you throw at this thing, as long as we maintain this set of living arrangements, it's a heat engine. So that doesn't bode well for somebody who lived off-grid, like I did for a decade, trying to solve the greenhouse gas problem. One more for the mistakes have been made file. Continued industrial activity could cause functional extinction, so could decreased industrial activity, as it turns out. And that's because of something called the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming. There's about an hour-long presentation on BBC about global dimming. It came out in 2005, long before science had significantly addressed the topic. And I'll describe what's going on with global dimming shortly, but suffice to say at this point that as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity could generate a 1 degree C global average temperature rise in a very short period of time. In somewhere between 5 days, according to James Hansen, and 6 weeks, which seems to be the current consensus among climate scientists, after the aerosols fall out of the atmosphere. Research so far, according to a paper published this year, greatly underestimates the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming. So that's inconvenient. So one mechanism that could lead to such activity is a financial collapse, say a stock market collapse that leads to local economic collapse within a country or within many countries that would contribute to a significant decline in industrial activity. Again, as little as 35% reduction in industrial activity could cause up to a 1 degree C global average temperature increase.
How is the decrease causing it? I understand how the increase.
I'll get to that shortly. And how about right here? This is called the aerosol masking effect. What happens when we burn greenhouse gases, especially coal, and especially conventional coal, not clean coal, but the bad stuff, we produce sulfates, aerosols or sulfates that go up into the upper atmosphere. And they serve as an umbrella. They dim the planet by serving as an umbrella. So yes, we're producing carbon dioxide and water vapor by burning fossil fuels. We're producing methane. Global warming is occurring, but global warming will occur a lot faster if we don't have these sulfates protecting us. So at the same time as industrial activity warms the planet by putting CO2 and other greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere, which blankets the Earth and holds the heat close to the Earth, trapping some of the long-wave radiation, just like it does in your car when you park in the sun on a winter day. At the same time industrial activity does that, industrial activity also produces these aerosols that prevent light from coming into the atmosphere and warming the planet to begin with. So it's a classic catch-22. Damned if we do, damned if we don't. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by living off-grid, by making all these significant changes in our lives, by reducing the amount of time we spend in a personal automobile and instead taking trains and buses and so on. And if we do that, that will lead directly to a loss of these sulfates or aerosols in the atmosphere, and therefore will cause abrupt warming. Doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. It could be that with this civilization, as with all prior civilizations, a significant reduction in the grain harvest will cause the civilization to be unable to feed people. And this has happened repeatedly throughout history. Civilizations are based on the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale. This never happened through the first 290,000 years of our species, Homo sapiens. This never happened. And then coming out of the Pleistocene, the temperature warmed, coming out of the last ice age, warmed, stabilized. That's really important. The temperature stabilized at about 1.5 degrees Celsius above ice age conditions, about 13.5 degrees Celsius. Stabilized there, which allowed us, all over the globe, to start growing grains at pretty large scale. Suddenly, whereas civilizations never grew up before, now they're popping up like trolls on YouTube, all over the place just a few thousand years ago. So if we somehow experience a decline in the grain harvest as a result, for example, of the 83% decline in earthworms in till the fields as opposed to beyond, we could see a loss of the ability to feed people at a large scale. Or maybe it'll be a land hurricane. We've been hearing a lot about this recently, but this headline is from June 30th, 2012. In the Midwest this year, we're hearing a lot about the grain crop being spoiled, sitting in silos that are flooded because the farmers weren't able to sell their crop because of tariffs with China, most notably. And so it could be that we experience a significant enough decline in grain harvest and therefore storage that it will cause this set of living arrangements to be threatened by hunger at a large scale. And then finally, we could experience an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. Whoops, didn't make it in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, or 2018. So we've dodged 6 bullets so far. But in this paper by Maslowski and colleagues, they projected an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. How important is that? The president of Finland, in a joint press conference with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office in August of 2017, briefly summarized the peer-reviewed literature on the topic and said, in just a few words, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. We haven't had an ice-free Arctic in more than 3 million years. Our species has been here for 300,000 years. Every time in the planetary past that we've had an ice-free Arctic, it was associated, the planet experienced what we call Cretaceous or hothouse conditions. So the last time we had, for example, this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there were pine trees growing in Antarctica. This time, though, the rate of change is happening way too fast for those trees to migrate to Antarctica and make it in time. And you see here some data from 5 days ago. This year's Arctic sea ice extent is considerably lower than it has been at this date in the past. So this is the mean, the solid line, the average ice extent or cover, and this is 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. This is the previous lowest year of Arctic ice, which was last year, and here we are considerably below that point. And it could be that we lose habitat for Homo sapiens as a result of the current El Nino. The El Nino Southern Oscillation takes the carbon dioxide and the heat that is stored in the battery we know as the planetary ocean and releases it out onto land. So you can see what happens during El Nino Southern Oscillation events. The planet heats up. This is a relatively strong El Nino event in 2015, 2016. This is the one from 97, 98, the hottest one ever recorded. And if we get just a moderate to severe El Nino, it might take us well beyond the 2 degrees that is a worry because it threatens the ability to grow grains at scale. So I'm not predicting that this will happen. In fact, it could be that the El Nino fades away and becomes a minor concern, but every time we release heat and carbon dioxide from the ocean during these El Nino Southern Oscillation events, it poses a real threat to continued warming of the planet. So there's your list of 7 distinct paths to functional extinction, meaning that there's no longer habitat for our species. And I'm less sure about the last one on the list than I am sure about the others. If any of these previous first six occur, then I'm pretty sure we're going to lose habitat for Homo sapiens. That might not be the case with the El Nino because it might turn out to be a weak or moderate El Nino Southern Oscillation. Rate of change, as I've indicated repeatedly, is very, very important, and I'm going to give 4 examples here of species that nearly went extinct or did go extinct in a very short period of time. I'm told repeatedly that Homo sapiens cannot go extinct in a short period of time. There's 7.7 billion of us. You can't kill us all that fast. I hear this all the time. I'm not trying to kill anybody that fast, by the way. And I think it is possible for our species to go extinct very quickly once we lose habitat. Already, we're losing habitat for humans all over the globe. Look at the refugee crisis on our southern border. Same thing has been happening for several years in Western Europe as a result of loss of habitat for humans in the Middle East and Northern Africa. Same thing is happening in Australia and New Zealand because of loss of habitat in the South Pacific on island states. The long-lived Bellinger River snapping turtle was exposed to a mysterious disease and nearly went extinct. Okay, you say, so it nearly went extinct, but we saved it. Through intervention, humans saved the Bellinger River snapping turtle. It nearly went extinct in less than a month, and now it lives in a zoo. The only remaining individuals were all cleaned up and now spend their time in a zoo, where obviously, ultimately, they will go extinct because there's no habitat remaining now that it has suffered this terrible disease. So let's move on to real extinction because the Bellinger River snapping turtle is not dead yet, at least not all of them. Let's talk about the dodo. Everybody knows about the dodo. We make jokes about it all the time. How stupid was the dodo? Well, the stupid old dodo evolved in an environment that suddenly changed. Specifically, Dutch colonizers showed up and brought monkeys and pigs and cats. Those monkeys and pigs and cats destroyed the habitat for the dodo. And in 80 years after those first monkeys, pigs, and cats showed up, the last dodo died.
It wasn't because humans were killing them, although there was a little bit of that. The Dutch realized early on that they didn't taste that great. So mostly they killed them just for the fun of it. Humans are such an odd species. You know, here's a bird that is naive because it's never encountered humans before, or monkeys, or pigs, or cats. And so it just walks around oblivious to the dangers. And so the Dutch colonizers whacked them on the head for sport. Because, you know, humans. Passenger pigeon, we mostly know about the passenger pigeons. Its habitat was destroyed and it was hunted close to extinction about 1900. Then a few samples were put in the Cincinnati Zoo. Had there been habitat remaining, the birds that hatched, the nestlings, could have been released out into the wild and they would have survived. It wasn't just the hunting, it was the loss of habitat as well. And so, just a handful of years after habitat was lost, the last individual died in the Cincinnati Zoo. Similar thing happened to a couple of other species of birds at about the same time, which indicates to me that the Cincinnati Zoo is not a great place to hang out. Passenger pigeons occurred in flocks of more than 1 million birds. More than 1 million birds. It was said that they sounded like thunder. They blocked the sky for days when they flew over. For days they darkened the sky. They were so abundant it was inconceivable that we could cause their extinction. And yet we did in a very short period of time. Not fast enough for you? How about the San Benedicto rock wren, which lived on the San Benedicto Island off the coast of Mexico and went extinct in less than 2 weeks? Yes, the volcano blew up, but it was a bird, so it could fly. It lost habitat on that island, and there was no other habitat on Earth for this species. Less than 2 weeks. So then, the topic nobody wants to think about. Trust me, not even me. It's a paper that came out November 13th of last year in Scientific Reports, again a peer-reviewed journal article, titled, and this is the only peer-reviewed article, it is one of 2 articles I've ever seen that has annihilate in the title. Because scientists don't talk like this. Scientists are like the most reserved people on planet Earth, right? So right now, for example, if a fire broke out right here at the front of the building and another fire break out at the back of the room, the scientists in the crowd would be looking around and taking notes and thinking about how in the future we might be able to prevent these kinds of problems. Scientists tend to be very reserved. It's important what the lead author said down here at the bottom of the page in an interview that came out coincident with the release of the paper. The paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. This is why humans will go extinct. Not because we're not clever. I think we misnamed ourselves. Homo sapiens, the wise ape? I don't think so. Homo calidus, the clever ape? Much more accurate. We're very clever. We can adapt to any number of factors, but the loss of life on Earth is not one of them. This paper predicts the loss of all life on Earth. This could annihilate all life on Earth. That's what they're talking about, environmental change, specifically rapid environmental change. And what they're talking about is a global average increase in temperature of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, which takes us right up to this dotted yellow line. So it was right here at 13.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees above ice age that civilizations broke out, and now we're about at the shoulder of this person, and it's this temperature that the paper by Strona and Bradshaw indicates will cause the loss of all life on Earth because, again, of the rapidity of change, because we're headed there so quickly. Sam Carana, in a paper from mid-July 2016, predicted a global temperature rise of more than 10 degrees C. I took a more conservative approach and concluded that we're only headed for 22 degrees C, hothouse or the Cretaceous style temperature, and also the most common temperature experienced by Earth over the course of the last 2 billion years, and that it seemed likely we're headed here by 2026. Subsequently, Carana added one additional feedback after a paper came out less than a month ago in the peer-reviewed literature, and that feedback indicates that the clouds could be stripped away by high carbon dioxide levels. And if that happens, that adds another 8 degrees Celsius and takes us to this black line right here. Far and away the highest temperature in planetary history over the last 2 billion years. So that'll be inconvenient. It's not as if we hadn't had a warning here and there. From 1989, Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program, says we have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve this whole greenhouse effect. And then the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, as I already indicated, follows up 14 months later and says we got to stop at 1C. That's the absolute upper limit. Science writer David Spratt says somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 degree is when we triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases was so worried about in 1990. So we've already triggered at least 6 dozen of these self-reinforcing feedback loops. This is from 13 years ago yesterday. 13 years ago yesterday, Time magazine said we should be worried, in fact very worried about climate change. It's not a future problem, it's already here. That's 13 years and a day ago. The predictions and projections keep coming. In fact, the United Nations in their recent report, October of last year, they no longer use the conventional 2100 timeline. They switched it up. They said we have until 2030 to fix things, whatever fixing things means in this case. And in fact, they used as a target 1.5 degrees C. We got to keep it to 1.5 degrees C as compared to 2C, because 2C is going to be too catastrophic. Well, guess what? We're at least at 1 3/4 right now. So trying to keep the temperature at 1.5 degrees C seems a little ridiculous. Secretary General of the United Nations comes out just a month before then and says we have until 2020 to avoid runaway climate change. If you see a shortening of the timeline as we go along here, then I think you're seeing this correctly. And of course, we haven't done anything. Increasingly, it seems we're headed for this kind of temperature instead of this kind of temperature, 2 degrees C above the 1750 baseline. Just a few words on how we might proceed, because I don't know. It's all individual. There are 7.7 billion responses to a terminal diagnosis. By the way, you got a terminal diagnosis at birth. We all know by now that birth is a sexually transmitted disease that is proven fatal in every case, right? We all know that. We all know time is short. It was in early March of 2015 that the world's oldest human being at the time was celebrating her 117th birthday. And when asked to ponder the first 117 years of her life, she said, "It seemed rather short." I turn to practitioner of the death trade, as he calls it, Stephen Jenkinson, for some important lines about hope, the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, not hopeful, not hopeless, which are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. And taking a page from the Grief Recovery Institute and taking a definition from the Grief Recovery Institute, I would say that grief recovery is required to proceed. indicating that maybe if I had a time machine, we could reel it back a few decades and we'd be fine. But in fact, Clinical Psychology Forum comes out about a month or so in advance of the stated publication date, as is common with peer-reviewed journals. And so I've indicated there the abstract from my recent paper, which is called Becoming Hope-Free, influenced by Stephen Jenkinson's work. I too concur that we need to become hope-free. And the paper essentially states that back in the good old days, in the 1960s and 1970s, medical doctors, with approval from medical ethicists, determined that it was perfectly okay to lie to patients. Physicians would lie to their patients regularly because hope was deemed as unimpeachably good, and to remove hope by telling somebody they were going to die was deemed a terrible thing. So medical doctors would lie to the patient so that they would maintain hope. They would sometimes tell the family, your uncle's going to die, or sometimes not. And this was considered perfectly okay. Today, that's called malpractice. Conventional climate scientists. Again, I turn to Homer and point out that any moment might be our last. In the paragraph before this one, Homer was describing why the gods envy humans. The gods who live forever have no incentive to stop and smell the flowers. You know how that goes. I try instead, and I'm just going to tell you what I do, because I'm in no position to tell you what to do. I will continue teaching until I can no longer teach, because I was born a teacher. It's not what I do, it's who I am. I came home from school 2 weeks after it started. They didn't have kindergarten or preschool where I lived in Weep, Idaho, of all places. And so I came home from first grade, maybe 2 weeks into the semester, carrying the Dick and Jane primer. And I flopped it in front of my poor 4-year-old sister and pointed at a figure and said, "What's that?" And she said, "It's a dog." And I was immediately frustrated and mad. It's not a dog, it's Spot. I was enraged. She couldn't even tell Spot from a dog. Rinse and repeat with Puff the cat. Puff, not a cat. And I'm trying to teach my poor 4.5-year-old sister how to read. And how stupid am I? Really? 18 years after I taught Mary Truglio in a conservation biology class, back in those days I required students in all of my science classes to complete a significant piece of art or literature as a major part of their grade. And for her, that significant piece of art or literature is right here. I met her 18 years later, and she still had it. I met her a couple of months ago in Florida. I was down there with my partner Pauline, and we met Mary from 18 years, who I hadn't seen in 18 years, and she brought this blueprint, and she said, "Look what I saved," and she started crying, and then Pauline's crying, and then I'm crying, and everybody's crying, and we mess up that blueprint, and it was just a mess. So I will continue trying to make people cry, and not, because of the sympathies we have for each other and the sentimental value. And I will continue to deliver presentations like this one as shown in the left panel. I'll submit to interviews, including with the likes of Bill Nye, the other science guy. I was so excited because I'd never worked a clapboard before. So Bill Nye and a 8-person crew come out to the homestead I created in New Mexico, and I got to use the little clapboard. Of course, they'd all used it 1,000,000 times, so they couldn't care less. I thought it was just fun. And for the first 3 times, it was great. And then I couldn't get anybody to take it away from me. I was just sort of stuck with it. And after the first 3 times, it's just the same, so it's not really much fun. At some point, I will deliver my last PowerPoint presentation. I need to Photoshop my face in there. And I will dance till I can no longer dance. And that's the subtitle of my latest book, which came out in February of this year. The title is Only Love Remains. dancing at the edge of extinction. That's what I'll do. I don't know what you'll do. Some people take the terminal diagnosis and they respond in anger or denial or any of the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross describes in her 1969 book. And I'd like to think that I've reached acceptance at this point, although I certainly go back and forth, and I'm certainly in no position to tell you what to do. So I'll stop right there. It's been more than long enough. And I'd be happy to take your questions or your thoughts or your ideas about how we proceed and how you might proceed.
So you said that if we lose the Arctic, that we lose the planet, and then you were saying that we haven't done anything. Well, I'm sure that you've noticed our brand new coal plant out here that they're expecting to burn for the next 50 years. So my question is to you, after examining your little tour here around town, do you think we've already lost the Arctic?
I think that we have lost the Arctic. I'd be very surprised if we didn't experience an ice-free Arctic this year, consistent with projection in the paper in Earth and Planetary Sciences, the annual review. And if it's not this year, because of latent heat, because of the inertia built into the system, we'll almost certainly lose the Arctic ice within the next couple of years. I don't think it's stoppable at this point. I see engineers throwing out some pretty crazy ideas about how we might cool the Arctic, but I don't see anybody attempting to implement those ideas. So I think we're on the cusp. In fact, I think we're over the cliff, Wile E. Coyote style, and we just haven't looked down yet. And I'm not happy in saying that, but I think that's where we are. Now, I would gladly be proven wrong if we get to September of this year and we don't have an ice-free Arctic. That would give us a reprieve for another year or two, and there's a lot of variability in Earth systems. So it could be that blue areas in the Arctic right now, the size of Montana, because they have no ice, it could be that that does not lead to an ice-free Arctic. It could be that there's significant refreeze early. We don't know. And this is the problem. I'm asked every day for somebody's expiration date. Every day somebody asks me, when am I going to die? And I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish I could tell every one of you the day you were going to die. That would make it so much easier for all of us, wouldn't it? It really would. I mean, we'd know when to call people on the phone and say, I'm going to die in 15 minutes. Oh, I had the wrong time zone. That'll be an hour and 15 minutes, whatever. And that would make it easy to complete those relationships. We could say goodbye. We could do the things we really wanted to do. We could quit the job we no longer like. But we don't know. And that's a real pain, at least for me. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have a scenario in mind for what you think will happen when the Arctic Ocean goes ice-free?
Well, the question is, what scenario do I have in mind when the Arctic Ocean becomes ice-free? I can't imagine that we won't see a tremendous burst in methane once the Arctic Ocean becomes ice-free. I can't imagine that once we have the blue ocean, it won't be absorbing a lot of heat that it currently reflects. So we have the albedo effect, or reflectance, working for us right now, even with a little ice. So there's a whole bunch of factors. In fact, years ago, I read a paper that I'm not going to be able to cite that was in The Atlantic or something like that, a popular magazine, pointing out 29 self-reinforcing feedback loops in the Arctic alone. So it's a whole lot of phenomena happening there at one time, and when we lose the ice, it's going to accelerate all of those. So I suspect that if we don't have an ice-free Arctic until, say, September, and typically the minimum ice for the year coincides with the autumnal equinox, so approximately September 20th. So if we only get a few days of open ocean, then we might not release a whole bunch of methane. We might not have a tremendous heating all of a sudden. Or we might, and it'll be delayed, and that will influence the crop production the following year. So come next spring and summer of 2020, we'll experience massive crop loss. If, on the other hand, the ice-free Arctic comes in July, the earlier it comes, I'd say, the greater the existential threat. Because of the heating and the consequent impacts on current year's grain production. Because without those grains, we can't maintain this set of living arrangements. Without the ability to store those grains, it doesn't take long before we don't have bread on the shelves. And every civilization requires bread and circuses. We got the circuses. We got that shit covered. But bread, that's a big deal. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on environmentalism? Do you think that's not really important at this point since?
What are my thoughts on environmentalism? I'm a lifelong environmentalist. I would never, and I'm a conservation biologist, so I'm very committed to conservation. I'm very committed to taking what I think are right actions from a Buddhist perspective, right action, and not being attached to the outcome. Does my message give you liberty to trash the planet because we're all going to die anyway? If you want. That's not what I'm doing. I'm living as if my time is short, but that doesn't mean that I'm throwing my trash in the street. That doesn't mean I'm giving up taking responsibility for myself. And I wouldn't encourage you to do anything differently than taking responsibility for yourself. So how you act in light of this information is really up to you. Am I encouraging irresponsibility? Some people think so. Some people think I'm actually paid by the Koch brothers. To which I can only say, where's the paycheck? I haven't drawn a paycheck for 9 years, 342 days. Not one. So I'm not working for anybody. I'm working for the species who have no voice. I'm working for the marginalized individuals who have no voice. I'm working for the living planet. And I think we're toast. I think we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. I think we're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. But that doesn't mean I'm going to act differently or, quote, misbehave towards people or the living planet.
I just want to remind everyone that the sign-in sheet is going around so that the dialogue can continue. And on Saturday night, we are having a smaller private gathering of interested parties, location TBA, around 7 p.m. And if you're interested in being included in that deeper dialogue, please put a star next to your name and you'll get an email from us by Saturday morning.
You know, this information causes some people to despair. And other people, and almost everybody is confused as a result. And so I would encourage you to try to keep the conversation going so that at least you have people that you can talk to about this topic. Because it isn't fun to carry around in your head this information by yourself. And when you bring it up with your friends or your coworkers, they're going to give you looks like you're out of your mind. I've been there. 17 years since I lost my mind. And so one of the best things you can do for yourself in terms of self-care is to have this conversation with other people, if only to demonstrate to yourself that you're not insane. And the conversation need not focus on the fact that we're all going to reach our terminal diagnosis at some point. That's really not the focus of these conversations. Yeah.
Right, yeah, I was going to say, what is the benefit of these kind of conversations? I mean, I'm kind of skeptical of some certain scenarios, but that could be more for future conversations. But, you know, as humans, as the species, we develop a fight or flight kind of situation, right? So, I was just kind of piggybacking on what this individual said. Wouldn't it be more beneficial for climatic solutions to develop, rather than posing a kind of like a doomsday kind of situation, right, where it almost looks like there's all these things going against us, so there's no way to fight back, so the only natural thing is to flee. Would it be possible, would it be a better way of developing solutions by offering perspectives of possible, the possibilities of solutions so that we don't go into this fight, but rather flight rather than we go to this fight?
Right, so if I can summarize, wouldn't it be better to, instead of fleeing,
Right.
to hold our ground, Apache dog soldier style, and protect the place where we live with respect to climate change? And that was my initial thought. So more than a dozen years ago, 14 years ago, I started looking for a place to land. And a few years after that, I found the place. In August 2007, I began creating the platinum grade homestead so that I could live off grid and grow all of my own food. Built a big orchard, lived in a straw bale house, passive solar heated, 3.15 kilowatts solar array on the top, 2 solar pumps, a hand pump, rainwater harvesting off the roofs, and so on. And years later, I learned about the full impact of the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming, which truly takes us to damned if you do, damned if you don't. Had everybody followed my lead as I really thought they would? And now it makes me laugh. I mean, I was a charismatic, very successful professor. I'm like Professor White Guy. Who wouldn't follow me off grid? It was the right thing to do. And of course, had a significant number of people done that, we would have lost the aerosol masking effect. The planet would have heated up catastrophically, and we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So, is it better to fight than to flight? I don't know what fight means in light of this catch-22 that is the aerosol masking effect. So I'm frequently accused of giving up or allow people to give up their hope. And I think about when we in the past have made radical changes as a society, and I'm thinking about the Manhattan Project, World War II. And what inspired that? Fear, not hope. Hope is the belief in a favorable future. If we believe things are going to work out, we don't do anything. And I don't promote fear, and I don't promote hope. I think there's the twin sides of the same con job, as Jenkinson calls it. So I don't know what this means, except that I did my best when I created that homestead, and it turned out it was the wrong choice.
Are you just saying, kind of more succinctly, that you're kind of just trying to rattle complacency?
Am I trying to rattle complacency? No, not at all. You know, I'm asked essentially every day about how to live. I recommend living fully. I recommend living with intention. I recommend living urgently with death in mind. I recommend the pursuit of excellence. I recommend the pursuit of love. In light of the short time remaining, I recommend all of the above, louder than before, more fully than you can possibly imagine, to the limits of this restrictive culture and beyond. For you, for me, for us, for here, for now. Live large, be you, and bolder than you've ever been. Live as if you're dying, because soon you will be. I can't say it any more succinctly than that. I'm not encouraging people to give up, whatever that means to you. I encourage taking right action from the perspective of the anarchist I am. Taking responsibility for myself and for my human community.
And has everyone had a chance to sign and star if they're interested in the Saturday conversation? If I missed anyone, I want to just make sure you got it. Okay, can you send it? This Saturday.
That meetup would be on this Saturday. Again, I'll be presenting tomorrow night at
7 o'clock at Cachet Auditorium.
Cachet Auditorium, 7 o'clock, same time as I started tonight. And I will spend more time going into the personal response that people are clearly interested in with their questions. So I'll give a few more recommendations about my personal response to the terminal diagnosis and a little less time on the evidence per se, because that's available everywhere. Right there. Yes, you. Yeah.
In man's history, there has been evidence that there were cases of almost mass extinction, and there were pockets of people, of individuals that survived. Do you think that could possibly happen? And I don't mean in numbers.
Okay. So the question is, in the past, it appears that humans have experienced near extinction in the past. And there were pockets of humanity that remained. And do I think it's possible that that could happen again? I think almost anything is possible. But we're headed for a very abrupt rise in temperature that is going to destroy most, if not all, life on Earth. And so far, I've been taking the optimistic approach in that I haven't talked about the nuclear power plants. There are 450 some around the world that will experience catastrophic uncontrolled meltdowns when people stop going to work. So if there are a few pockets of individuals not paid, I can't imagine they will be going to work at nuclear power facilities to try to maintain the unsustainable nuclear power creation indefinitely. So it would surprise me, and I was going to be one of those people for a long time. I thought that was the outcome I was pointed toward. And then the whole aerosol masking effect and nuclear power plants entered my mind, and I realized that I would have far greater impact and would allow myself to live a more positive life if I did what I'm doing now, which is to warn people about the existential threat. So I have become a citizen journalist in addition to being a scientist. I'm accused all the time, every single day of giving up by journalists who are doing a lot less work than I'm doing and getting paid a lot more for it. And I'm essentially doing that. I'm providing information for people about what is likely to come and how they might respond to that information and walking them through the thought processes that I've been going through for the last 17 years. And it's been useful and liberating for some people, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. And for other people, it just, they say the truth will set you free, but it'll really piss you off before it does. And so for most people, they're sort of stuck in that phase. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on population control or a superbug that's going to wipe out a lot of people, and if that would make a difference? Or
Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin were my heroes. Paul Ehrlich's book, Population Bomb, came out in 1968. Most people don't know that he co-wrote it with his wife, Anne, but the publisher wouldn't let her name appear on the cover as an author because clearly women don't know anything about population control. So it's a little weird. You should ask the question, you being a woman and all. So for 21 years in college classrooms, I encouraged my students to not contribute to the underlying problem with all of our environmental problems, and that's an exploding human population. 21 years, every class I ever taught, and not a single one of my students didn't have children. If I were attached to the outcome, I'd be a mess. For 21 years, I told my students, please don't have children. I set a model. I didn't have children. My wife, I was in a relationship with this woman for more than 35 years. She was the sixth of 6 Catholic children, and she was willing to forsake having children for the greater good. So I think not having children was a great idea 60 or 80 years ago, but that train left the station.
But, okay, looking at it from a political issue maybe, I want to be politics. The government promotes having children, The state promotes having children. I don't care what they say, they have their method of doing it. So,
All governments promote having children because civilizations persist only as long as they grow. Civilizations don't grow or collapse, they grow and collapse. They grow after they reach overshoot, too many people, and we've been there for a long time, and then they collapse. So there will either be very few people on the planet relatively soon, or there will be none. My guess is none. And I'm willing to bet that in either case, it won't include you and me. Thus my suggestion that we live like we're dying, like we don't have long. I would love to think that we can scale this back, as I taught for 21 years in the classrooms, that we could scale this back and stop having children and come to grips with some of our really important environmental issues. But we've triggered those 5 or 6 dozen self-reinforcing feedback loops, and we know about global dimming or the aerosol masking effect. So I don't think there's any way out of this, and I've talked with a long list of lifelong environmentalists and engineers and people who think they can fix anything, and so far I'm still thinking that we're not going to fix anything. And I'm not happy about that. I think that train left the station. Still, I encourage people to not have children, because who would want to bring children onto a dying planet? Who wants to live next to, say, Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant in New York? Oh, that's where I live. Given that it's on the verge of melting down catastrophically with plutonium, thereby polluting the environment for the next couple million years. That's a long time. Do you want the microphone to say them with?
No, I just want to say I've been a lifelong environmentalist. I began my environmentalism when I was 14 years old, and I'm 37 now. And I won't stop being an environmentalist either until the day that I die. And my particular interest is with the health of the ocean. And there was a time that I reached despair because my activism and my advocacy was not being received. People were ignoring it. And for a long time, my cause was plastic bags. I was talking to plastic bags, and the grocery stores, bring their own bags, people can do it. Before plastic bags, people brought their own plastic to market. And then also plastic bottles. They stopped using plastic bottles to drink beverages. But no one listened, and I went into despair and depression, and I thought, what's it all worth? I recovered my spirits, and I do believe that we are in trouble. But I don't think that we need to suffer because of it and be angry. I think the natural response is to be angry at what has occurred outside of our control before we were even born. However, I do agree that it's time to live with urgency and with passion and to honor ourselves deeply and other life. And I appreciate your call to action, and that's what I want to say. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I'll stay here and talk with you individually, but people are starting to filter out, and I respect your time. I have a few books if you would like to purchase one, and I'll sign it, and even if you don't, you can hang around and chat with me for as long as they will let me stay here. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd encourage you to come again tomorrow night as well. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.